The late summer heat baked the dusty ground of the auction yard, shimmering in waves that distorted the distant shapes of holding pens and pickup trucks. It was a heat that settled deep in the lungs, thick with the smells of manure, sweat, and cheap concession stand coffee. Elias Thorne stood at the back, a statue carved from stillness, his shadow a long, sharp line against the trampled earth. He had not attended an auction in 10 years. The noise, the smell, the casual trade of life for coin. It was a world he had walled off, a room in his memory with a bolted door. He did not know why he was here today. The pull had been a strange, hollow ache in his chest, an instinct he had stopped questioning long ago. A murmur rippled through the assembled ranchers, a mix of pity and coarse humor. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was worn smooth by decades of patter, seemed to lose his rhythm for a moment. They were leading the last lot of the day into the ring. It was a horse, though the word felt too generous. It was a framework of bones draped in a hide the color of old ash, its head hung low, the light in its eyes long extinguished. Scars webbed its flanks like lightning frozen on a winter sky. It was broken, not just in body, but in some deeper, essential way that the crowd could feel. "All right, folks," a late entry. The auctioneer stammered, recovering his professional cheer. "A gelding, sound of wind and limb, mostly. Needs a good home, some groceries. What am I bid? Pull start me at $50. 50 for this, fine animal." A dry chuckle moved through the onlookers. $50 was a charity they were not inclined to offer. The horse stood under the brutal sun, unmoving, as if it had already accepted its fate, was the rendering plant. It took a single, shuddering breath, dust puffing from its nostrils. And in that small movement, something broke inside Elias. He saw not a collection of scars, but a map of a pain he understood. He saw a silence he knew intimately. The world around him, the drone of the auctioneer, the smell of the dust, it all fell away. There was only the horse and the profound, silent scream emanating from it. 100. A voice called out, sharp and dismissive. It came from a man in the front row, Richard Sterling. His boots were polished, his shirt crisply ironed despite the heat. He was a man who owned much of the valley, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He barely glanced at the horse, his bid an act of casual power. The auctioneer brightened. $100 from Mr. Sterling. Do I hear 150? Silence. Then, Elias moved. He walked forward, his own worn boots scuffing a path through the dust. He did not raise a hand. He did not call out a number. He walked past the rows of confused faces until he stood at the edge of the ring, the splintered wooden fence pressing against his belt. The horse, for the first time, lifted its head a fraction of an inch, its one good eye fixing on him. Elias raised his left hand, not in a bid, but with his palm open. He slowly, deliberately, twisted the simple gold band from his ring finger. It was a gesture he had not made in a decade, and his skin beneath it was pale and tender. He held the ring out towards the auctioneer. The yard fell utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sterling turned in his seat, a look of incredulous disdain on his face. "What is this?" the auctioneer asked, his voice losing all its professional cadence. "Son, we deal in cash here." Elias said nothing. He just held the ring, his gaze locked with the horses. It was all he had left of that other life. The last piece of Eleanor. It was a price beyond money, an offering of one ghost for another. "This is ridiculous," Sterling scoffed, rising to his feet. "I'll give you $500 for the worthless nag, just to be done with this farce." The auctioneer looked from Sterling's cash to Elias's ring, then to the horse, which had taken a single, weak step towards Elias. He saw the hushed attention of the crowd, the raw, unspoken story playing out in the center of the ring. He was a man of rules and numbers, but he was also a man who had lived his whole life in these hills. He recognized a current deeper than commerce. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sold," he said, his voice quiet, directed only at Elias. To the man with the ring. A collective breath was released by the crowd. Sterling stared, his face a mask of cold fury, before turning on his heel and stalking away. Elias lowered his hand, the ring still clutched in his palm. He walked to the gate, opened the latch, and stepped inside the ring. He did not take the worn lead rope offered by the handler. He simply stood before the horse, and after a long, still moment. The broken animal lowered its head and followed him out of the yard, leaving the whispers and the dust behind. The silence of Elias's ranch was a physical presence. It had settled into the wood grain of the barn, coated the windows of the small house in a fine layer of dust, and colonized the spaces between the floorboards. For 10 years, that silence had been his only companion, a constant reminder of the sounds that were gone. The cadence of Eleanor's laugh, the frantic drumming of a small boy's feet on the porch. The pale horse stood in the main corral, a spectral figure against the weathered gray of the fences. It had not moved from the spot where Elias had left it, its head low, a creature waiting for the end. Elias worked around the edges of its stillness. He filled a trough with fresh water, the sound of the pump a loud intrusion into the quiet. He forked hay into a feeder, the sweet, dry scent a ghost of a life of purpose. The horse watched him with a profound weariness, its gaze betraying nothing. It did not eat. It did not drink. They were two solitudes, sharing a patch of sun-scorched earth, the air between them thick with things unsaid. Later that day, a truck rumbled up the long, untended driveway. Martha, the town veterinarian, stepped out. Her face was etched with the same kindness and concern it had worn a decade ago. She leaned against the corral fence, her eyes on the horse, then on Elias. "Sheriff Brody called me," she said, her voice soft. "He said you bought a horse at the auction." She paused. "He said you paid with your wedding ring, Elias." Elias did not look at her. He continued to methodically coil a length of old rope. "It needed a place to stand." "It needs more than that," Martha replied, her gaze clinical but compassionate. "It's half-starved, dehydrated. And those scars," she trailed off. "Where did it come from?" "Don't know," Elias said. It was the truth. He knew nothing, yet he knew everything. The horse's pain felt like an echo of his own. Martha sighed, a sound of gentle frustration. "Elias, people are talking. Sterling is furious. You haven't come down from this mountain in years. Now this. Are you all right?" He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same desolate landscape she had seen the night of the accident. A vast, empty space where a life used to be. "I'm the same," he said. It was the truest thing he could offer. She stayed for another hour, talking quietly about the town, about the weather, leaving space for him to speak if he chose. He did not. When she left, the silence descended again, heavier than before. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, Elias decided he had to clean the horse. The dirt and filth felt like a sacrilege, a layer of dishonor on its suffering. He approached slowly, with a bucket of warm water and a soft rag. The horse flinched but did not move away. Its skin trembled under his touch. He worked with a patience he had forgotten he possessed, his hands moving gently over the bony terrain of its back and ribs. He cleaned around the old scars, his fingers tracing the history of cruelty written on its hide. And then, as he worked his way up to the withers, his hand froze. Beneath the grime and matted hair, nearly invisible, was a brand. It was faint, distorted by a long, puckered scar that ran through it, but it was unmistakable. A stylized S intertwined with a crescent moon. The rag fell from his hand into the dust. His breath caught in his throat. It was the brand of Seraphim Stables, the place where Eleanor had boarded her horse. The horse she had been riding that night. The horse that the official report said had broken its leg in the fall and been put down on sight. A beautiful, fiery bay gelding named Seraph. This creature was not a bay. It was a ghost. But the brand was the same. The memory he had buried under a mountain of grief and silence began to stir, a terrible tremor deep beneath the surface of his carefully constructed emptiness. The horse in his corral was not just any broken animal. It was a witness. The brand was a key, and it had unlocked a door in Elias's mind he had sworn never to open again. The night came, but sleep did not. He sat on his porch, the pale horse a motionless silhouette in the moonlight, and let the memories come. He saw Eleanor, her hair the color of spun gold, laughing as she galloped across the high pasture on a spirited bay. He saw the gleam of the silver conchos on the custom tack he had made for her. He saw his son, Leo, a small boy with his mother's eyes, reaching his hands up towards the powerful animal, utterly fearless. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, Elias was in the barn. He moved past the tidy, empty stalls to the tack room at the far end. He had not set foot in here since he had packed her things away. A thick canvas tarp, gray with a decade of dust, covered a large pile against the back wall. He pulled it back, and a cloud of dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a high window. The smell hit him first. Leather, horse sweat, and the faint, floral scent of the conditioner Eleanor had always used. It was the smell of his life before. There was her saddle, its silverwork tarnished. Bridles, blankets, grooming kits. He ran his hand over the worn leather of the saddle seat, his throat tight. He was not just looking for an object. He was excavating his own heart. He began to search, not sure what for. Some proof. Some explanation for the ghost in his corral. He moved with a feverish intensity, his hands sifting through the relics of a shared past. He checked saddlebags, unbuckled straps, ran his fingers along every seam. Nothing. Just the hollow echo of what was lost. Defeated, he sank back on his heels. His eyes fell on a small, simple object hanging from a hook on the wall, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a halter, the first thing he had ever made for her, long before the fancy saddle. Simple, dark leather, with a single, unique braid he'd woven into the noseband. He had been so proud of it. She had used it every day. He took it down from the hook. The leather was stiff, but it softened in his hands. He traced the braid with his thumb, the memory of making it sharp and clear. As his fingers explored the familiar texture, he felt something odd. A thickness in the leather cheek piece. A slight bulge. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The cheek piece was stitched with 2 layers of leather. He took out his pocket knife, the one he always carried, and with a hand that trembled slightly, he carefully sliced the stitches along the bottom edge. He pried the layers apart. Inside, nestled in the dark space, was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. It was not a letter. It was not a photograph. He unfolded it under the beam of sunlight. It was a birth certificate. His eyes scanned the printed words, his mind struggling to assemble them into a coherent reality. Name, Cale Sterling. Date of birth, 7 years ago. Mother, Eleanor Thorne. Father, Richard Sterling. The world tilted on its axis. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. Eleanor. Sterling. A child. His mind reeled, grasping for purchase on a truth that was completely rewriting his past. His grief, the pure, clean thing he had nurtured for 10 years, was suddenly fouled by a decade-old lie. The accident. It wasn't just an accident. It was the day she was leaving him. Tucked behind the certificate was another document, a legal agreement. A custody arrangement, signed by both Eleanor and Sterling. It granted Sterling full parental rights in the event of her death. It was all there, cold and clinical. The secret life she had lived. The future she had planned without him. A cold dread washed over him, colder than any grief he had ever known. The report had mentioned his son, Leo, had been thrown from the crash, lost in the ravine. They never found him. But this document. Cale Sterling. A 7-year-old boy. The right age. What if Leo hadn't been with her? What if it was Sterling's son in the vehicle? The son nobody knew existed. And the horse. Seraph. Sterling would have had every reason to make it disappear. It was the last living link to his affair, to the scandal, to the woman who had died carrying his secret. The horse in his corral wasn't just a witness. It was the living evidence of a lie that had defined Elias's entire existence for a decade. He stood there in the dusty beam of light, the papers trembling in his hand, a man unmoored from his own history. The dust had not yet settled on Elias's shattered reality when the sound of an engine, too smooth and quiet for a farm truck, sliced through the morning air. He stepped out of the barn, blinking in the harsh sunlight, the damning papers clutched in his fist. A sleek black SUV, gleaming and utterly out of place, was making its way up his rutted driveway. It came to a stop, and the driver's side door opened. Richard Sterling emerged, looking as cool and pressed as he had at the auction. But his eyes were not casual now. They were chips of ice. He was not alone. The back door opened, and a woman, a severe-looking governess, helped a small boy out of the vehicle. The boy was slender, with pale skin and dark hair. He held a white cane, sweeping it tentatively in front of him. He was blind. Sterling's gaze swept over the dilapidated ranch, a look of profound contempt on his face, before it settled on Elias. "Thorn," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I'm here for my property." Elias said nothing. He watched the boy, who stood silently beside the car, his head cocked as if listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside. A terrible, impossible certainty began to form in Elias's gut. "The horse you absconded with from the auction," Sterling clarified, stepping forward. "It belongs to me. I have the bill of sale from its previous owner, before that backwater auctioneer decided to accept jewelry." He practically spat the word. "You have no legal claim." He held out a folder, a clear threat, a legal document, a show of power. Elias's hand tightened on the papers in his own. Two sets of documents, two vastly different stories. "The horse stays," Elias said, his voice raspy from disuse. A flicker of something, surprise, then fury, crossed Sterling's face. He was not used to being defied, especially not by a man he considered a broken relic. "Don't be a fool, Thorn. You're in no position to make demands. A man living like this," he gestured at the silent house, the overgrown yard. "It would be easy to have you declared incompetent, unstable, a danger to yourself and others." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Just then, another vehicle appeared at the end of the lane. Sheriff Brody's patrol car, followed closely by Martha's dusty truck. They had seen Sterling's vehicle pass through town and had followed, their instincts sharpened by years of knowing the men involved. They parked behind the SUV, a quiet, solid barrier. Sheriff Brody got out, his face unreadable. "Sterling, didn't expect to see you up this way." Martha got out too, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the pale, silent boy standing by the car. Her expression was one of dawning horror and comprehension. Sterling's jaw tightened. The arrival of witnesses had complicated his simple retrieval. "Sheriff, I'm just collecting what's mine. This man has taken something that doesn't belong to him." "Is that so?" Brody said, his gaze shifting from Sterling to Elias, and then to the horse, which had moved to the fence line, its attention fixed on the small gathering. The allies had gathered, not a posse, but a small, defiant group bound by a shared history and a sense of justice. The compassionate vet, the wise old lawman, and the broken man who had just discovered his entire past was a lie. They stood against the polished, ruthless power of the man who had authored that lie. The boy, Cale, remained silent through it all, a fragile, still point in the center of the rising storm. The sky, which had been a placid blue, began to bruise with gray clouds moving in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. It whipped Sterling's hair and tugged at the hem of the governess's dress, a physical manifestation of the tension that had seized the yard. A storm was coming. "I'm not leaving without the horse," Sterling stated, his voice low and dangerous. He nodded to his driver, a large man who had been standing silently by the SUV. The man started walking toward the corral gate. Elias moved to block his path. He was smaller than the driver, older, but he stood his ground with the rooted stubbornness of an old tree. "You're not taking him." "Get out of the way, Thorn," Sterling snapped. He took a step forward, his polished facade cracking to reveal the raw anger beneath. "This has nothing to do with you. It's a simple property dispute." He looked at Brody. "Sheriff, are you going to allow this?" "Elias," Brody said, his voice even. "What's this about?" Before Elias could answer, Sterling laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "He's lost his mind. He's grieving. It's been 10 years, and he's still obsessed with her. Let me tell you the truth, Thorn. Eleanor was leaving you. She was coming to me, to a better life. The boy, Cale, he's my son. She chose me. She chose my world. You were just a sad chapter she was closing." The words were designed to be cruel, to shatter what little was left of Elias. And they did hurt. They struck him like stones, each one a fresh wound. But as he stood there, absorbing the poison of Sterling's confession, he felt a strange clarity. The grief was still there, but now it was joined by a cold, hard anger. An anger on behalf of the horse, on behalf of the boy. As Sterling's driver reached for the gate latch, the pale horse, which had been a statue of resignation, suddenly threw its head up with a wild snort. It pinned its ears back and lunged toward the fence, its teeth bared. It was a terrifying display of spirit from an animal that had seemed to have none left. The driver stumbled back, his hand recoiling as if from a flame. The horse moved to stand directly behind Elias, a solid, living shield. It had chosen a side. And then another choice was made. The blind boy, Cale, who had been a silent pawn in the confrontation, pulled his small hand from the governess's grip. He took a hesitant step away from the car, his head turned toward the sound of the agitated horse. His white cane dropped into the dust. He raised his hands into the empty space before him, as if feeling for a connection. A desperate, clear cry tore from his throat, a sound that cut through the rising wind. "He's mine." Everyone froze. Sterling stared at his son, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The boy took another step, his voice stronger now, filled with a certainty that defied his sightless eyes. "His name is Seraph." The name hung in the air, an impossible truth made real. The horse, hearing the name, let out a low, soft nicker. It was a sound of recognition, of reunion. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, not for Elias, but for Martha. She stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. The first drops of rain began to fall, spattering dark circles in the dust. "He's right," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She looked directly at Sterling. "I was the vet on call that night. The night of the accident." Sterling's eyes widened. "Martha, be quiet." "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't be quiet anymore. You were there. You pulled the boy from the wreckage yourself. He was injured. His eyes, you told me he was your nephew. You said the horse, Seraph, had a broken leg and needed to be put down immediately. You pressured me. You paid me to sign the disposal certificate without a full examination. But I never saw a fracture. I just saw a traumatized, exhausted animal. You had it hauled away before I could even write my report. The truth was out, raw and undeniable, spoken into the heart of the brewing storm. Sterling hadn't just gotten rid of the horse to hide his affair. He had hidden his own son, blinded in the crash, passing him off as a nephew to avoid the scandal. He had erased every piece of that day, every link to Eleanor, not out of grief, but out of a desperate, selfish need for control. The rain began to fall harder, washing the dust from the air, as if trying to cleanse the yard of its decade-old secret. The rain fell in earnest now, a driving, cleansing sheet that turned the dust to dark mud. It plastered Sterling's expensive shirt to his skin and ran in rivulets down his face, mingling with the sweat of his panic. Martha's words, coupled with Cale's cry, had dismantled his power more effectively than any physical force could have. The truth was loose in the world, and it could not be put back. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his hand resting not on his weapon, but on his notepad. "Sterling," he said, his voice calm but carrying the full weight of the law. "Based on Dr. Franklin's testimony, I'm opening a formal investigation into insurance fraud, falsifying a veterinary report, and a decade of felony child concealment and endangerment." He looked from the pale, shaken man to the boy, Cale, who was now taking trembling steps toward the sound of the horse. "You'll need to come with me." Now, for a moment, Sterling looked like he might fight or flee. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, an angle, a way to reassert control. But there was none. His driver stood frozen. The governess looked horrified. Martha and Elias stood like sentinels in the downpour. His power, built on wealth and secrets, had evaporated in the rain. He seemed to shrink, the arrogant posture collapsing into a pathetic slump. Without another word, he turned and walked to the sheriff's car, a man utterly defeated not by violence, but by the weight of a long-buried truth. As the patrol car's doors closed, sealing Sterling in with his lies, the world grew quiet again, the only sound the steady drumming of rain on the barn roof. Elias watched the red and blue lights disappear down the lane, a final, fading pulse of the life he once knew. The anger, the betrayal, the shock, it was all still there, a chaotic storm inside him. But beneath it, something else was beginning to surface. A profound, aching release. He turned. Cale had reached the corral fence. He could not see the horse, but he stretched his small hands through the rails, his fingers searching. The horse, Seraph, lowered its great head, nudging the boy's searching hands with its soft muzzle. It was a gesture of impossible gentleness. The sight broke through the final wall inside Elias. The grief he had held in, a rigid, suffocating thing for 10,000 days, finally gave way. It was not a violent sob, but a quiet, internal surrender. A tremor ran through his body as the dam of his sorrow crumbled, allowing a decade of unshed tears to fall silently, masked by the rain on his face. He was not just grieving Eleanor anymore. He was grieving the life he thought he'd had, the truth he had never known, the boy who was lost, and the boy who was found. He walked slowly over to the fence and stood beside Cale. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and placed his large, weathered hand on the boy's small, soaked shoulder. Cale flinched for a second, then relaxed into the touch. Two survivors of the same shipwreck, finding their anchor in the steady presence of a horse and the quiet aftermath of a storm. The past was not erased, but its hold was broken. The rain washed over them, and for the first time in a very long time, Elias felt clean. Weeks turned into a month, and the month turned into the golden blush of early autumn. The sun now cast long, gentle shadows across the ranch, and the oppressive heat of summer had given way to a crisp, clean air that smelled of pine and curing hay. The silence of the place had changed. It was no longer the oppressive silence of absence, but the peaceful quiet of sanctuary. The broken fences were mended, their new wood a pale scar against the old gray. A small, thriving vegetable garden, planted with Martha's help, grew beside the porch, its green a startling splash of life against the muted tones of the landscape. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Cale now lived with Elias. The legalities had been surprisingly simple, with Sterling facing a mountain of charges and no one else to claim the boy. He navigated the ranch not with his cane, but with a growing confidence born of memory and touch. He knew the path to the barn by the feel of the packed earth beneath his feet. He knew the warmth of the sun on the porch steps. He knew the exact spot where Seraph liked his ears scratched. Elias had found a new purpose, one that arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, daily rhythm of care. He was no longer just tending to the wounds of his past. He was tending to a life, to two lives. He taught Cale about the world through his other senses, the rough texture of bark, the smooth surface of a river stone, the complex song of a canyon wren. He was healing the boy, and in doing so, he was beginning to heal himself. One late afternoon, with the sun hanging low and painting the valley in hues of amber and rose, Elias and Cale were in the high pasture. Seraph grazed peacefully nearby, his coat now filled out and gleaming with health, the ghost-like thinness replaced by the solid presence of a horse reborn. Cale sat on a large, flat rock, his face tilted up towards the warmth of the sun. "He's happy," Cale said, his voice soft. He didn't need to see the horse to know. He could feel it in the air, in the relaxed way Seraph moved and breathed. Elias stood beside him, looking out over the land that had once been his prison and was now becoming his home again. "We all are," he said, the words feeling foreign but true on his tongue. Cale smiled, a pure, unburdened expression that lit up his face. He reached out his hand, and Elias took it. They stood there for a long time, a man, a boy, and a horse, an unconventional family forged in the crucible of a shared past. The pain of what was lost would always be a part of their story, a quiet undercurrent to their days. But it was no longer the whole story. As the sun dipped below the ridge, casting them in a final, golden light, a new chapter was beginning, not with a grand pronouncement, but with a shared silence, a quiet understanding, and the first, hopeful steps on a long road forward.